Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the story of human civilization. For 99% of our existence, we lived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, our lives dictated by the rhythm of the wild. Our ancestors were, by all accounts, remarkably healthy, with varied diets, robust physiques, and likely more leisure time than many of us experience today. They lived in small, egalitarian bands, largely free from the strictures of hierarchy, property ownership, or the constant threat of epidemic disease. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something utterly perplexing happened. We stopped, we settled down, we started farming, and for all the vaunted progress that followed, the cities, the empires, the art, the science, this initial decision was in many ways a colossal downgrade for the average human. It led to harder labour, poorer health, more disease, social inequality and constant warfare. We traded freedom for fields, mobility for mud bricks, and a diverse diet for a monotonous gruel. Why would anyone do such a thing? What possesses an entire species to willingly embrace a harder, sicker, more constrained existence? That contradiction, that almost paradoxical decision to embark on a path that seemed to offer more challenges than benefits, is where the story of civilization truly begins. It's not a tale of inevitable progress, but of an accidental revolution, a series of choices with unforeseen consequences that locked us into a trajectory from which there was no return. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Here's the thing that blows my mind about the dawn of civilization. It wasn't an obvious upgrade. We often imagine our ancestors suddenly realizing the genius of agriculture, then happily settling down to build cities and empires. But the reality is far messier, far more desperate, and frankly, a bit tragic. The transition from small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural communities was less a eureka moment and more a slow, grinding inevitability, a series of reluctant compromises that fundamentally reshaped human existence. Think about this for a second. For hundreds of thousands of years, our species thrived on movement and diversity. Then, almost overnight in the grand sweep of human history, we chose the plough over the spear, the granary over the open plain. But what did we lose in that exchange? The story begins in a crescent-shaped band of land stretching from the eastern Mediterranean coast through present-day Turkey and Iraq, down to the Persian Gulf. This region, known as the Fertile Crescent, was a biological hotspot, a natural laboratory where wild ancestors of key crops and animals thrived. Around 10,000 BCE, as the last glacial period receded, creating warmer, wetter conditions, something shifted. Small groups of hunter-gatherers, like the Natufian culture, began to exploit this bounty in new ways. They weren't farming yet, not in the traditional sense, but they were harvesting wild grains in such abundance that they could settle down, at least semi-permanently, in larger villages. Sites like Ain Malaha in the Jordan Valley, dating to around 10,000 BCE, housed hundreds of people in stone-built circular houses, long before anyone truly tilled a field. They had sickles for harvesting wild wheat and barley, grinding stones for processing, and even buried their dead with grave goods, hinting at early social distinctions. This semi-sedentary lifestyle, supported by the sheer richness of naturally occurring resources, was the crucial precursor, the accidental discovery that staying put could sustain more people. But the real revolution, the one that truly set us on the path to civilization, was domestication. This wasn't a sudden invention, but a gradual process of coevolution, an unwitting partnership between humans and the plants and animals around them. For plants like wild wheat and barley, humans started favouring mutations that made harvesting easier, grains that stayed on the stalk rather than shattering at the slightest touch, larger seeds and uniform ripening. We selected for these traits year after year, eventually creating entirely new species dependent on human intervention to survive. By roughly 9000 BCE, in places like Tel Abu Huraira in Syria, we see clear evidence of domesticated emmer wheat and rye. The same slow, deliberate process occurred with animals. Wild goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs, once hunted, were gradually penned, culled, and bred for docility, meat, milk, and wool. Think about the sheer audacity of this, taking wild, free-roaming creatures and reshaping them to our will, creating living food factories. This wasn't just about controlling nature. It was about fundamentally altering it, and in doing so, fundamentally altering ourselves. The immediate consequence of successful domestication was a food surplus. For the first time, human communities could produce more food than they immediately needed, and crucially, they could store it. This surplus was the bedrock upon which all future civilizations would be built. It allowed for population growth as more mouths could be fed. It freed some individuals from the constant grind of food acquisition, paving the way for specialized labor. No longer did every person need to hunt or forage every day. Some could become potters, making vessels for storage. Others could become builders, constructing more permanent homes and communal granaries. The village of Jericho, dating back to around 9000 BCE, provides a stunning example of this early transition. It wasn't just a collection of huts. It was a substantial settlement, protected by a massive stone wall and a ditch, featuring a 30-foot-high stone tower. Why such monumental construction for a simple farming village? The answer lies in that surplus. Stored wealth, in the form of grain and domesticated animals, became something worth defending, something worth fighting over. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting accumulated assets. This shift from nomadic fluidity to sedentary life brought with it a cascade of profound and often contradictory changes. Socially, the egalitarian structure of hunter-gatherer bands began to erode. While early farming villages might have retained some communal aspects, the ability to accumulate personal wealth, more land, more livestock, more stored grain, naturally led to hierarchies. Some families became wealthier, more influential, perhaps controlling key resources like water access or the best land. This nascent social stratification was a far cry from the complex class systems of later empires, but the seeds were sown. Living in close proximity also created new social pressures and new forms of cooperation. Large-scale projects like the massive irrigation systems that would eventually define Mesopotamian agriculture required coordinated labor on a scale unimaginable to hunter-gatherers. This meant the emergence of leaders, organizers, and decision-makers whose authority extended beyond kin groups. Economically, the concept of private property became deeply ingrained. Land, once a communal resource to be traversed, became something to be owned, cultivated, and defended. Bartering networks expanded, exchanging specialized goods like obsidian for tools or decorative shells. The very nature of work changed drastically. Here's a detail most people miss. Agriculture, despite its promise of abundance, was harder work. Ploughing fields, planting seeds, weeding, harvesting, threshing, grinding grain, this was back-breaking, repetitive labour that consumed far more hours than hunting and gathering. Studies of skeletal remains from early agricultural populations show higher rates of arthritis, spinal degeneration, and dental problems compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Their diets, though more reliable in terms of caloric intake, were often less diverse and nutritious, leading to deficiencies. Culturally, the focus shifted from the immediate present to the cyclical future. Farmers needed to track seasons, predict rainfall, and understand soil conditions. This drove the development of early astronomical observations and calendrical systems. Rituals became tied to the agricultural cycle, prayers for rain, harvest festivals. Ancestor worship took on new significance as people were buried in fixed cemeteries, often beneath their homes, linking them permanently to the land they cultivated. Think of a site like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, dating from around 7,500 BCE. This extraordinary proto-city housed up to 8,000 people, an incredible density for its time. What's fascinating is that there are no streets. The mud brick houses are built right up against each other, and people entered their homes through holes in the roofs using ladders. This unique architectural style speaks volumes about their world. A tightly knit, communal, defensive society, where the outside might have been perceived as a constant threat, and internal social cohesion was paramount. And about those downsides, the concentration of people and animals in permanent settlements was a breeding ground for disease. Zoonotic diseases, jumping from domesticated animals to humans, became rampant. Measles, smallpox, influenza, diseases that would later decimate entire populations, likely have their origins in this period. Living in close quarters with human waste and contaminated water sources led to endemic gastrointestinal illnesses. Life expectancy often decreased and infant mortality rates soared, so while agriculture allowed for more people to survive, it didn't necessarily mean a better life for each individual. It was a Faustian bargain, greater numbers at the cost of individual health and freedom. This is where it gets genuinely interesting. The very quote, zero we celebrate was built on foundations of increased suffering for many. The relentless pressure of feeding growing populations, coupled with the need to protect valuable stored resources, inevitably pushed these large villages towards even greater complexity. The need for coordinated labour on a larger scale, to build more sophisticated irrigation canals, to manage disputes over land and water, to defend against increasingly organised raids from other agricultural communities, demanded more robust forms of governance. Specialised roles expanded from artisans to administrators, priests, and eventually full-time warriors. Temples, initially centres of religious worship, often became economic hubs, collecting grain as offerings and redistributing it in times of need, effectively acting as early banks and welfare systems. The sheer logistical challenge of managing thousands of people and their resources was the engine driving further innovation, laying the groundwork for the invention of writing, monumental architecture, and the first true states. We've laid the foundation with mud bricks and cultivated fields, tracing the extraordinary and often harsh journey from mobile bands to dense sedentary communities. But these were, for all their complexity, still just villages, albeit very large ones. The real leap, the emergence of the first true cities, with their sprawling populations, elaborate social hierarchies, intricate political structures, and the revolutionary invention of writing, the undisputed hallmarks of what we called civilization, was still to come. This next monumental shift, driven by the very agricultural pressures we've explored, would fundamentally reshape human existence once more, transforming the landscape of the Fertile Crescent into the cradle of empires. Chapter 2. We left off with humanity poised on a precipice, teetering between robust, if nomadic freedom, and the settled, yet restrictive life of the early agricultural village. Jericho, Ain Malaha, these were impressive, sure, with their walls and granaries, but they were still essentially overgrown villages. They hinted at something grander, something far more complex, but they weren't yet the true metropolises that would define civilization as we understand it. So, what happened next? How did these nascent communities balloon into sprawling urban centres, teeming with people, ideas, and a terrifying new kind of power? This, my friends, is where the story gets genuinely mind-bending, because the very success of early agriculture, the increased food surplus we talked about, became its own driving force, a relentless engine pushing us towards an entirely new way of living. More food meant more people. More people in a confined space meant more mouths to feed, more waste to manage, more disputes to settle, and more resources to protect. It was a feedback loop, a societal centrifuge spinning faster and faster. Think about it. You've got fields of domesticated wheat and barley, herds of sheep and goats penned up. This isn't just a larder, it's wealth. And wealth, as we've already seen, demands protection. Those walls at Jericho weren't just for show, they were a declaration. We have something, and we intend to keep it. But as populations grew, as the stakes got higher, the need for organisation escalated beyond simple village elders and informal councils. This is the urban revolution, a term coined by the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, and it's a good one because it truly was revolutionary. We're talking about a transformation that wasn't just quantitative, more people, but profoundly qualitative. It fundamentally restructured human society, economy, and even our very psychology. Imagine the plains of Mesopotamia, specifically the southern part in what is now modern-day Iraq, around 4000 BCE. Here, amidst the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a new kind of settlement began to emerge, dwarfing anything that came before. We're talking about places like Uruk. By 3200 BCE, Uruk wasn't just a village, it was a city of staggering proportions, encompassing perhaps 1,000 acres, home to somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. To put that in perspective for millennia afterward, most cities around the world would struggle to reach even a fraction of Uruk's population. This wasn't just a gathering of huts. This was a monumental undertaking, a living, breathing testament to human audacity and organizational prowess. How did such a thing even happen? Well, the fertile silt deposited by the rivers made for incredibly productive farmland. allowing for immense agricultural surpluses that could feed a massive non-farming population. But the scale of irrigation needed to harness these rivers to feed these growing populations was staggering. It required coordinated labour on a scale never before seen, far beyond what a small village could manage. Ditches had to be dug, maintained, and shared. This necessitated a central authority, a power structure capable of organising thousands of people, compelling them to work together for a common, albeit burdensome, goal. And with that, the specialisation of labour exploded. It wasn't just a few artisans anymore. Now you had farmers, yes, but also full-time potters, weavers, metalworkers, stone carvers, brickmakers, carpenters, brewers, bakers, and merchants. But crucially, you also had a burgeoning class of priests, scribes, administrators, soldiers, and ultimately, rulers. The old egalitarian ways, where everyone pulled their weight in food production and shared the bounty, were utterly gone. Instead, a rigid hierarchy solidified. At the top, you had powerful elites, priests, kings, military commanders, who controlled the vast surplus of food and resources. Below them, a layer of bureaucrats and specialists. And at the very bottom, the vast majority of the population working the fields or performing manual labour, often under compulsion, supporting the entire edifice. The city, in essence, became a giant machine designed to extract and redistribute resources, with a few at the top pulling the levers. This concentration of people and resources also meant the rise of monumental architecture. Think of the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, massive step pyramids that dominated the skylines of these early cities. These weren't just places of worship, they were the heart of the city-state, serving as granaries, administrative centres, and symbols of immense power. The temple became the nexus of economic and spiritual life, often owning vast tracts of land, employing thousands and collecting tribute. It was the original corporation, the original government, and the original church, all rolled into one. Here's the thing that blows my mind. Managing all this complexity, the vast stores of grain, the herds of livestock, the thousands of workers, the distribution of rations, the collection of taxes, the allocation of land, the enforcement of laws, it became impossible to do simply by memory or oral tradition. A priest-king couldn't possibly keep track of every bushel of barley or every worker's hours. The human brain, for all its wonders, has its limits when faced with the sheer volume of data generated by a large, complex society. This immense administrative burden, this need for accountability and transparency, even if only for the rulers, led to one of the most profound inventions in human history, writing. It wasn't born out of a desire to compose epic poems or philosophical treatises. No, it was born out of spreadsheets. Seriously. The earliest forms of writing, like the cuneiform developed by the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, were essentially tools for record keeping. Imagine an administrator in Uruk trying to track how many jars of oil were delivered to the temple, or how many sheep were sent to market, or how much grain was paid out as wages to the workers building a ziggurat. They started with simple pictographs, little drawings representing objects. A drawing of a head meant a drawing of a bowl meant. But quickly these pictographs evolved. They became stylized, abstract, and began to represent not just objects, but sounds and ideas. This was a game changer. Writing allowed information to transcend time and space. No longer did a message rely on the fallibility of human memory, or the speed of a messenger. Laws could be codified, histories could be recorded, like contracts could be drawn up, and inventories could be meticulously maintained. It created a new class of specialists, the scribes, who held immense power because they controlled access to this vital new technology. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, the original information architects. The invention of writing further cemented the hierarchical structure of these societies. It allowed for the creation of standardized laws, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, though that came a bit later, which applied to everyone theoretically, but were enforced by the powerful. It allowed rulers to project their authority over vast distances and generations, solidifying their legitimacy and control, and this, inevitably, led to the formation of the first true states, and eventually empires. These burgeoning city-states, with their concentrated wealth, specialized armies, and complex administrations, were constantly interacting, sometimes through trade, often through conflict. Resources were finite, and the need for more land, more labor, more access to trade routes was insatiable. Warfare, which had been present in earlier societies, now became organized, professionalized, and capable of truly devastating scale. Leaders emerged who were not just religious figures, but powerful military commanders who could conquer neighboring cities, consolidate territory, and extract tribute. This was the birth of the empire, the first truly regional powers that sought to control vast territories and diverse populations. Think of Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE, who forged the world's first true empire, uniting the disparate city-states of Mesopotamia under a single ruler. It was a brutal process, driven by conquest and coercion, but it laid the groundwork for all subsequent empires and states. So, from a few seeds of domesticated wheat and a handful of penned goats, we have arrived at Uruk, at writing, at kings and empires. This entire trajectory from scattered hunter-gatherers to vast urban populations governed by complex bureaucracies took only a few thousand years, a blink of an eye in the grand sweep of human history. But as we marvel at these monumental achievements, let's not forget the cost. For the vast majority of people living in these early cities and empires, life was harder, more regimented, and far less free than it had been for their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They laboured under the yoke of kings and priests, paid taxes, fought in wars, and lived with the constant threat of disease in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Their diets were often monotonous, their work repetitive, their personal autonomy diminished. The quote 6 we spoke of earlier had come to fruition on an epic scale. We had traded freedom for fields, mobility for mud bricks, egalitarianism for empire. We had gained numbers, complexity, and the capacity for truly astonishing collective achievements. But we had also arguably lost something vital in the process, a certain quality of life, a direct connection to the natural world, and a measure of individual well-being that would take millennia to even begin to reclaim. And from this path, once taken, there was no return. We were on the road to civilization, and the journey had only just begun. The blueprint was set, the die cast. With Sargon of Akkad forging the world's first true empire in Mesopotamia, humanity had crossed a Rubicon of epic proportions. We had moved from scattered egalitarian bands to vast interconnected networks of production and power, bound together by the plough, the scribe's stylus, and the sword. The accidental revolution of agriculture had now birthed its inevitable complex offspring, the city-state and the empire, and from this point there was no turning back. Imagine walking through the narrow, winding streets of Ur or Babylon, millennia before Rome or Athens. The sensory assault would have been immediate and overwhelming. The clamour of the marketplace, the rhythmic thud of 1,000 hoes in distant fields, the acrid smoke from countless cooking fires mingling with the pungent stench of open sewers and animal pens. This was the price of density, the stark reality of urban living for the vast majority. Yet, amidst the squalor, there was also an undeniable grandeur. The colossal mud-brick walls, thick as a modern highway, promised protection from the chaotic world outside. The soaring ziggurats, stepped pyramids reaching skyward, were not just temples but cosmic mountains, connecting earth to heaven, proclaiming the city's piety and power to the gods themselves. These monuments, visible for miles across the flat plains, were engineered feats of staggering ambition, testaments to a collective will harnessed by a relentless hierarchy. What did this mean for you, the average inhabitant of Ur or Lagash? It meant your life was no longer your own in the way it had been for your hunter-gatherer ancestors. Your labour was no longer solely for your immediate family's survival, but for the sustenance of a vast anonymous collective, and more pointedly, for the enrichment of its elites. You were a cog in a colossal machine. Your movements were circumscribed, your choices limited. The open plains, once a source of boundless freedom, were now merely the dangerous, untamed wilderness outside the city walls, a place of bandits and rival tribes, a stark contrast to the security within. This wasn't some gentle communal living, dear reader. This was power, raw and unapologetic, meticulously structured and ruthlessly enforced. The king, often claiming divine sanction, was the ultimate authority, his word law, his decrees absolute. Priests wielding spiritual influence reinforced this order, their elaborate rituals and pronouncements legitimizing the hierarchy, making obedience a sacred duty. The gods, now enshrined in immense temples and served by a specialized clergy, demanded tribute and devotion, which conveniently flowed through the hands of the ruling class. This divine mandate was a profoundly effective tool for social control, weaving together the spiritual and the temporal into an unbreakable tapestry of authority. And then came the law, not the informal customs of a tight-knit clan, but codified statutes carved in stone, defining every transgression, every punishment. Hammurabi's code, while famous, was merely one of the most complete examples of a system that emerged across these early empires. A rigid framework designed to maintain order, protect property, especially the property of the elite, and ensure the smooth functioning of the state machine. An eye for an eye, yes, but often a poor man's eye for a rich man's tooth. The laws themselves were often stratified, reflecting the profound inequalities embedded in society. Justice, such as it was, became a tool of the powerful, reinforcing their position rather than ensuring universal fairness. For the vast majority, life in these early empires wasn't a grand adventure. It was a grueling grind. The rhythms of the city were dictated not by the sun and seasons alone, but by the relentless demands of the state. Your days were spent toiling in the fields, digging irrigation canals or hauling bricks for monumental construction projects. Your surplus, the fruit of your back-breaking labour, was siphoned off as taxes, tithes or tribute. destined for the granaries of the temple or the coffers of the king. Every bushel of grain, every head of livestock, every hour of labour was accounted for, meticulously recorded by the burgeoning class of scribes. This was the engine of empire, fuelled by the sweat of its populace. The health statistics, if we could gather them from the skeletal remains, continue to tell a grim story. Less varied diets, heavily reliant on a few staple grains, meant greater susceptibility to famine if a single crop failed. And the constant threat of epidemic disease sweeping through dense urban populations was ever present. Measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, all products of our close proximity to domesticated animals and each other, became silent, devastating companions to civilization. Life expectancy plummeted, and the physical toll of repetitive, arduous labour was etched into every bone. We gained numbers, yes, but we paid for it in suffering and diminished vitality, and war. War transformed from skirmishes between rival bands into organised state-sponsored slaughter. Empires expanded through conquest, their armies professionalised instruments of coercion. The price of peace was often submission, the price of defiance, annihilation. We built walls, yes, but those walls were as much for keeping people in as they were for keeping enemies out. They protected accumulated wealth, but they also enclosed populations, making them targets, their resources ripe for plunder by the next ambitious conqueror. The cycle of conquest and subjugation became a defining feature of the imperial age. Perhaps the most profound loss, however, was the erosion of individual freedom. The hunter-gatherer, for all their vulnerability to nature, possessed an autonomy unimaginable to the average city dweller. No king demanded their allegiance, no priest their tithes, no scribe tallied their debts. If a leader became too autocratic, you could simply walk away. If resources dwindled, you moved. But within the city, where would you go? The land was owned, the water controlled, the gates guarded. Your entire livelihood was tied to the state, to the granaries and the irrigation canals. This was a new kind of entrapment, a gilded cage perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. Debt slavery became a common fate, a cycle of obligation that could trap generations. For the first time, large segments of humanity found themselves not just working for a system, but literally owned by it, a profound and frankly tragic shift in the human condition. The sheer momentum of this new way of life was unstoppable. Once you had cities, you needed food. Once you had food surpluses, you needed administration. Once you had administration, you needed writing. Once you had writing, you needed laws. Once you had laws, you needed enforcement. It was a self-perpetuating, ever-expanding system, a historical flywheel that, once set in motion, could not be stopped. And the blueprint, refined in the crucible of Mesopotamia, was devastatingly effective. It would be replicated independently or through diffusion across the globe. From the fertile banks of the Nile Valley to the vast plains of the Indus, from the Yellow River to the high plateaus of the Andes, the same fundamental principles of intensive agriculture, urban centres, social stratification, and centralized power would emerge, each with their own unique flavour, but all echoing the foundational choices made in that crescent-shaped band of land we call the Fertile Crescent. So here we are, standing at the precipice of recorded history, looking back at the dawn of cities and empires. We marvel at the pyramids, the ziggurats, the intricate legal codes, the epic poems. These are the undeniable achievements of organized civilization. the collective triumphs of human ingenuity and cooperation on an unprecedented scale. But we must also ask, at what cost? For whom were these triumphs truly glorious? For every king on a throne, how many labourers toiled in the sun? For every scribe recording history, how many lives were lived and lost, unrecorded and unremembered, in the service of a system they could neither control nor escape? The journey from the free-roaming plains to the walled city, from the egalitarian band to the rigid hierarchy, was complete. We had built marvels, yes, but in doing so, we had also built our own cages, trading the wild freedom of our ancestors for the complex, often brutal, security of the state. And from this point, truly, there was no turning back. The gilded cage was built. The blueprint was drawn, etched into the very fabric of Mesopotamian society. And once established, once the gears of state, hierarchy and surplus extraction began to turn, there was, as we've discussed, no turning back. But here's the thing that blows my mind. This wasn't just a local phenomenon. This wasn't a unique, one-off Mesopotamian experiment. Oh no. The blueprint, this fundamental design for human civilization, was about to go global. Imagine a single, powerful idea, an operating system for human society, being developed in one region, and then, almost simultaneously, popping up in vastly different parts of the world. Because that's exactly what happened. While Mesopotamia was perfecting its particular brand of urbanized hierarchical living, other regions, often thousands of miles away and with no direct contact, were independently embarking on strikingly similar journeys. Think about it. The Nile River Valley, a ribbon of life snaking through an immense desert, saw the rise of ancient Egypt. The Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan and India gave birth to the Harappan civilization. Across the vastness of Asia, the Yellow River Basin in China became the crucible for a distinct yet structurally familiar civilization. And then, much later, thousands of years later, completely cut off by oceans, the Americas witnessed the emergence of complex societies like the Olmec, and later the Maya and Inca, while the Andes cradled civilizations like Norte Chico. Each of these places, a natural laboratory, a unique set of ecological circumstances, but each arriving at a strikingly similar conclusion: the need for centralized control, social stratification, monumental architecture, and a system to manage the agricultural surplus that defined their new existence. What does this tell us? It suggests that once humanity crossed that crucial threshold, the adoption of agriculture, the commitment to sedentary life, the ability to generate a surplus, the subsequent steps towards large-scale hierarchical civilization weren't just probable. They were in many ways almost inevitable. The pressures were universal. How do you feed more people? How do you protect your stored wealth? How do you organize labor for irrigation or defense? The answers, it seems, often converged on the same fundamental solutions: plough over the spear, granary over the open plain, the priest-king over the egalitarian council. It's a pattern that repeats with an almost eerie consistency, a testament to the sheer adaptive power of our species, but also, frankly, a bit tragic in its implications for individual freedom. These new centers of civilization, much like their Mesopotamian predecessors, quickly developed their own versions of the quote eight in Egypt. The pharaoh, a living god, held absolute sway, channeling the Nile's bounty through vast bureaucratic networks to build pyramids that defied the very passage of time. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, with their sophisticated urban planning, advanced sanitation systems and enigmatic script, show us a society perhaps less overtly militaristic than Mesopotamia, but still clearly organized around a central authority that could mobilize immense resources. China, with its early dynasties, forged a powerful imperial tradition emphasizing ancestor worship and the mandate of heaven to legitimize its rule, creating a state that would endure for millennia. The details differed, of course. Egyptian hieroglyphs looked nothing like Sumerian cuneiform. The gods worshipped on the banks of the Yellow River were not the same as those revered in the temples of Ur, but the underlying engine was identical, a small elite at the top, extracting resources from a much larger base of agricultural labourers, maintaining order through a combination of religious ideology, administrative control, and, when necessary, coercive force. This was the engine of empire, refined and replicated across continents, each new civilization adding its own unique cultural flourishes to the universal blueprint of human subjugation. Once these distinct civilizations began to flourish, the world truly entered an era of inter-civilizational contact. This wasn't just about the isolated development of internal structures anymore. It was about interaction, about the collision and fusion of these grand, complex societies. And what happens when powerful, organized states, each with a surplus to protect and a desire to expand, meet? You guessed it. Trade, cultural exchange, and perhaps most notably, war. The historical record from this period becomes a tapestry woven with threads of conquest and resistance. Empires grew by swallowing their neighbours, consolidating power, and extending their administrative reach. The Akkadians gave way to the Babylonians, then the Assyrians, each empire larger, more formidable, and more ruthless than the last. Egypt, too, had its periods of imperial expansion, pushing its borders into Nubia and the Levant. The Hittites, a powerful empire in Anatolia, clashed repeatedly with the Egyptians for control of vital trade routes and strategic territories. Later, the Persians would forge the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Greece to India, uniting vast and diverse peoples under a single centralized administration. This imperial expansion wasn't just brute force, although there was plenty of that. It was also about the diffusion of the Rei Nine concept itself. Conquered peoples were often integrated into the imperial system, adopting its administrative practices, its legal codes, its economic demands. The idea of a strong, centralized state, capable of organizing vast populations and resources, became the dominant paradigm. Where once there might have been tribal confederations or loose networks of villages, now there were provinces, satrapies, and client kingdoms, all feeding the insatiable maw of the imperial centre. Think about the sheer administrative genius required to manage an empire like Persia, or even earlier the New Kingdom of Egypt. You needed sophisticated systems of taxation, a professional bureaucracy, an efficient communication network, roads, messengers, and crucially, an ideology that could bind diverse populations to a distant ruler. Divine kingship, the idea that the ruler was chosen by the gods, or even was a god, became a powerful tool for legitimizing power and ensuring compliance. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic engines, landholders, and centers of political influence, reinforcing the state's authority at every turn. This was the engine of empire operating at full throttle, transforming vast swathes of humanity into subjects, cogs in a colossal machine designed to generate power and wealth for the few. So, here we are, surveying a world transformed. Millions of people, no longer free-roaming hunter-gatherers, but fixed to the land, beholden to rulers, living lives of often grueling labour within the confines of these burgeoning civilizations. But why? Why did this system, which for the average individual represented such a profound downgrade in quality of life, not only persist but thrive and expand? Why didn't humanity collectively reject the gilded cage and return to the relative freedom of their ancestors? The answer, my friends, is multifaceted and, frankly, a bit grim. First, there was the sheer demographic lock-in. Once populations swelled to millions sustained by intensive agriculture, there simply was no going back. Imagine trying to revert a city of 50,000 people to a nomadic hunter-gatherer existence. It's an ecological impossibility. The land could no longer support such numbers without the intensive farming practices that defined civilization. Humanity had painted itself into a corner of immense population density and resource dependence. Second, the system, for all its downsides, did offer certain advantages, especially for the elite, but also, in a limited sense, for the common person. Protection, for example. In a world of competing city-states and expanding empires, being part of a larger, organized entity offered a degree of defense against raids and conquests. A strong state could, theoretically, ensure a more stable food supply, though famines were still common, and organize large-scale projects like irrigation that benefited many. Technology, too, became inextricably linked to the state. Metallurgy, advanced tools, sophisticated building techniques. These innovations were often driven by the needs of the elite for weapons, monuments, and administrative efficiency, further cementing their power. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, was the power of ideology and the normalization of hierarchy. Generations grew up knowing no other way of life. The divine right of kings, the sacred duty to the gods, the inherent superiority of the ruling class. These ideas became deeply ingrained, accepted as natural law. Rebellion was not just dangerous, it was often seen as sacrilege, a disruption of the cosmic order. The very concept of individual freedom, as understood by our hunter-gatherer ancestors, likely faded into myth, replaced by the duties and obligations of a subject. The quote 11 became our reality, shaping our minds as much as it shaped our landscapes. The constant threat of warfare, the cycles of famine and disease, the back-breaking labour, the rigid social stratification. These were not aberrations, they were the norm. For millennia, humanity would live within these structures, constantly refining them, expanding them, and internalizing their principles. The monumental shift from the open plain to the walled city, from individual autonomy to state control, had completed its initial phase. We had built the foundations of a new world, one where our collective endeavours reached astonishing heights, but often at the profound expense of the individual human spirit. The story of civilization, from this point forward, would largely be the story of how we lived within, adapted to, and occasionally struggled against the constraints of this self-imposed, self-perpetuating system. And it would only get more complex from here. The fundamental trajectory was set. The blueprint for civilization intensive agriculture, centralized power, social stratification, and monumental architecture had been forged in the crucible of Mesopotamia and had since spread, both through direct influence and independent invention, across the globe. We had built our cages, and now the story wasn't just about building them, but about living within them, expanding them, and refining the intricate mechanisms of control that held them together. Think about it. Once you've committed to this system, once you have millions of people reliant on an agricultural surplus managed by a central authority, there's no going back to the open plains. The population density alone makes it impossible. So what happens next? The cage gets bigger, it gets more ornate, and frankly it gets more brutal. The early city-states, those ambitious, often warring proto-nations like Sumer Uruk or Lagash, were just the beginning. They were laboratories, constantly experimenting with how to extract more, control more, and conquer more. Warfare, which had been a localized skirmish among hunter-gatherers, or perhaps a means of raiding for resources, now became systematized, professionalized. It became the engine of expansion, the very hammer that forged empires. Why wage war? The reasons were legion, all rooted in the logic of the quote 12. You needed more arable land for your growing population, more resources to feed your elites, more tribute to fund your monumental projects, and more manpower to work your fields or build your walls. The early kings, those self-proclaimed divine representatives, understood this implicitly. Their legitimacy, their power, often hinged on their ability to protect their people and, more importantly, to expand their dominion. This is where figures like Sargon of Akkad, whom we touched upon earlier, become pivotal. Sargon wasn't just a powerful king, he was a revolutionary. He didn't just rule a city-state. He built an empire, a multi-city, multi-ethnic entity held together by force, administration, and a nascent imperial ideology. His Akkadian Empire, rising around 2334 BCE, stretched across Mesopotamia, uniting disparate peoples under a single crown. How did he do it? Through a standing army, loyal not to a local god, but to him, through a centralized bureaucracy that collected taxes, enforced laws, and managed vast resources. This was the Mesopotamian blueprint scaled up, perfected. But here's the thing that blows my mind. This wasn't an isolated phenomenon. Across the world, similar processes were unfolding. In Egypt, the unification of the upper and lower kingdoms, coalescing into the powerful Old Kingdom circa 2686 to 2181 BCE, saw the rise of the pharaohs, divine kings whose authority was absolute. Their monumental pyramids, those staggering testaments to human organization and engineering, weren't just tombs, they were colossal statements of power. Built on the backs of thousands of laborers, a testament to the state's capacity to mobilize and control. These structures screamed, quote, 13. What we see in these early empires is a relentless drive towards greater administrative complexity. Managing vast territories, diverse populations, and intricate irrigation systems required more than just a strongman with a sword. It demanded a sophisticated apparatus of governance. This is where the scribes, those silent architects of empire, truly came into their own. Their cuneiform tablets, initially used for tracking grain and livestock, now recorded laws, treaties, genealogies, and epic poems glorifying the rulers. Writing, once a simple ledger, became a tool of statecraft. a means to codify power and perpetuate ideology. Consider the Code of Hammurabi, enacted around 1754 BCE in Babylon. It's one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes. On the surface, it seems like a step towards justice, a move away from arbitrary rule, and in some ways it was. But look deeper, and you see the rigid structure of the gilded cage laid bare. It distinguishes between classes, nobles, commoners, slaves, and prescribes different punishments and rights for each. An eye for an eye might sound egalitarian, but it was often an eye for an eye of the same social status. It protected property, upheld the patriarchal family, and reinforced the divine right of the king. It was a legal framework designed not for universal freedom, but for maintaining the established order, for ensuring the smooth functioning of a hierarchical society. This is the paradox, isn't it? The very conditions that led to the quote 17 for the average individual, the concentration of power, the specialization of labor, the surplus of resources, also enabled astounding leaps in human knowledge and capability. We developed advanced mathematics to manage taxes and land surveys, astronomy to track seasons for agriculture and predict celestial events, sophisticated engineering for irrigation canals and monumental buildings, and even early forms of medicine within these urban centres. These were genuine intellectual and technological achievements, born from the demands and resources of civilization. But who benefited most? The elites. Who applied this knowledge? The specialized few. And who paid the price in terms of labor and freedom? The vast majority. The common farmer, toiling in the fields, might have seen impressive new temples or ziggurats rise on the horizon, but his daily life remained one of relentless labor, subject to the whims of the weather, the tax collector, and the soldier. He might have been protected from external raiders by the city walls, but he was simultaneously trapped within those walls, bound by debt, by law, and by an ideology that told him his place was divinely ordained. His individual well-being was secondary to the collective might and glory of the state, embodied by his king and his gods, and the empires themselves. They were not static. They rose and fell with a cyclical predictability that speaks to the inherent instability of such massive centralized systems. The Akkadian Empire eventually collapsed, giving way to new dynasties like Ur-III, then the Old Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi, followed by the Kassites, the Assyrians, and so on. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom gave way to a period of decentralization and civil strife, only to be reunified under the Middle Kingdom, which in turn fractured before the glory of the New Kingdom. These aren't just names and dates, they are echoes of the same fundamental struggle to maintain control over vast resources and populations, to project power, and to suppress the centrifugal forces of rebellion, invasion, and environmental degradation, like the salinization of Mesopotamian fields that plagued agriculture. Each collapse was often accompanied by immense suffering, famine, and warfare, only for a new power to rise, often from the ashes, and rebuild using the very same gilded cage blueprint. The particular architecture might change. Clay tablets in Mesopotamia, papyrus scrolls in Egypt, but the underlying structure remained. This era, spanning millennia from the first cities to the consolidation of these early empires, shows us humanity grappling with the consequences of its own accidental revolution. We had traded freedom for fields, mobility for mud bricks, and egalitarianism for the complex, often brutal hierarchy of the state. We had created systems that were incredibly resilient, capable of absorbing shocks and rebuilding, because the alternatives, returning to a hunter-gatherer existence, were simply no longer viable for the sheer numbers of people living within the cage. We were now locked into a path, a grand experiment in social engineering that would continue to evolve, expand, and occasionally shatter, but never fundamentally reverse. The stage was set for even larger empires, for global trade networks, and for the clash of civilizations that would define the next chapters of our story. The cage was becoming a continent-spanning network of interconnected yet often warring societies, each a testament to humanity's ingenuity and perhaps its most profound self-inflicted wound. Chapter 6. The blueprint for the Gilded Cage had been drawn, etched into the very earth, by ploughs and irrigation canals, and then replicated across continents. From the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the verdant banks of the Nile, from the enigmatic cities of the Indus Valley to the nascent dynasties along the Yellow River, the template held intensive agriculture, centralized power, social stratification, and the constant threat of organized violence. We had built these colossal structures, these first true civilizations, and then, inexorably, they began to build S. But merely having a blueprint isn't enough to sustain an empire, is it? It's not enough to build walls and issue decrees. To truly lock humanity into this new way of life, to make the cage not just sturdy, but seemingly natural, required something more profound than force alone. It required the systematic cultivation of belief, the subtle art of ideological control, and the relentless expansion of the state's reach into every corner of human existence. Think about this for a second. How do you convince millions of people, many of whom have never seen the king or pharaoh, to toil endlessly, to surrender their produce, and to potentially die in a distant war, all for the benefit of a distant elite? You don't do it just with spears. You do it with stories, with gods, with promises of cosmic order, and with the relentless grind of a system that offers no obvious alternative. This is where religion, as we understand it today, truly came into its own as a tool of statecraft. In these early empires, the line between divine and temporal power was not just blurred, it was often erased entirely. Kings weren't just powerful men, they were divine intermediaries, chosen by the gods, or even gods themselves. The pharaohs of Egypt, for instance, were living deities, their every utterance imbued with cosmic significance. The Sumerian Ensi and later Lugal ruled under the direct patronage of city gods, and their temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic powerhouses, landholders, and administrative centres. This divine mandate wasn't just a fancy title, it was the ultimate justification for hierarchy. If the king was chosen by the heavens, then his authority was absolute, and the social order he presided over was divinely ordained. Challenging the king wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. This isn't to say that people were simply duped. Faith was genuine, deeply held, and offered comfort and meaning in a harsh world. But its institutionalization, its fusion with state power, served a very specific purpose: to naturalize the unnatural, to make the gilded cage feel like the only possible home. And what better way to express this colossal power, this divine authority, than through monumental architecture, We're talking about structures that literally scrape the sky, built with technologies that still baffle us and demanding unimaginable amounts of labour. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, towering brick mountains reaching for the heavens, were not merely temples. They were physical manifestations of the state's power, visible from miles away, reminding everyone of the gods, and thus the king's, might. And the pyramids of Egypt? Good heavens, the pyramids! They weren't just tombs for dead pharaohs. They were immense, eternal propaganda, proclaiming the pharaoh's divinity, the state's wealth, and the collective ability to command resources on an epic scale. They were projects that unified populations not through shared liberty, but through shared, coerced labour, forging a collective identity anchored in the service of the divine ruler. Building them wasn't optional, it was a sacred duty, a tax on muscle and spirit. This sacred framework was buttressed by an increasingly sophisticated legal system. As societies grew larger and more complex, disputes multiplied, and the old ways of tribal arbitration simply couldn't cope. So, we started writing down the rules. Initially, this was about property rights, debt, and maintaining order, but soon, these scattered rulings coalesced into comprehensive legal codes, the most famous of which, Hammurabi's Code from Babylon, around 1754 BCE, offers a chillingly clear window into the social engineering of the Silded Cage. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, you might remember. But that's only half the story. Hammurabi's code was explicitly hierarchical. If a commoner knocked out the tooth of another commoner, sure, they lost a tooth. But if a commoner dared to strike a noble, the penalty was far more severe, and if a noble struck a commoner, often just a fine. The law wasn't blind, it saw social standing with perfect clarity. It codified inequality, making it official, sanctioned, and enforced. It was a mechanism for maintaining order, yes, but crucially, it was an order that preserved and reinforced the existing power structures. It told you your place, and it told you what would happen if you dared to step out of it. To administer these vast, complex, and legally regulated states, a new class of specialists emerged, the bureaucracy. Scribes, tax collectors, overseers, judges, priests, military commanders, an entire ecosystem of administrators whose livelihood depended on the smooth functioning of the state. They managed the granaries, distributed rations, recorded transactions, levied taxes, and conscripted labour. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about extending the state's tendrils into every aspect of daily life. For the average farmer, the state was no longer a distant abstraction. It was the official who demanded a portion of their harvest, the scribe who recorded their debts, the soldier who might conscript their son. The individual became a data point, a resource to be managed within the grand imperial machine. Meanwhile, the economic engine of these empires hummed with increasing complexity. While agriculture remained the bedrock, feeding the burgeoning populations, the demands of the elite and the state spurred diversification. Specialized craftsmen emerged: potters, weavers, jewelers, metallurgists. They produced not just for local consumption, but for trade, both within the empire and across vast distances. Mesopotamia, lacking timber, stone, and metals, relied heavily on long-distance trade networks, exchanging its surplus grain and manufactured goods for these vital raw materials. We saw the development of standardized weights and measures, early forms of currency, like the silver shekel in Mesopotamia, and sophisticated accounting practices, all to facilitate this intricate web of commerce. The state often controlled key industries, oversaw trade routes, and extracted its cut at every turn, further enriching the elite and solidifying its economic dominance. And then, of course, there was the constant shadow of warfare. With wealth came the need to protect it, and with population growth came the pressure to expand. The Sastian, quote 21, wasn't just an internal system, it was a competing entity in a world of other emerging cages. The invention of metallurgy, moving from copper to bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, around 3000 BCE, then to iron around 1200 BCE, revolutionized warfare. Bronze was stronger, sharper, and more durable than stone or copper, leading to superior weapons and armor. Iron, though harder to work, was far more abundant, democratizing access to stronger tools and weapons. These advancements weren't just about better plows, they were about deadlier swords, more effective shields, and the ability to project power further and more lethally. We saw the development of chariots, massive composite bows, and increasingly sophisticated siege engines. Warfare became a science, a brutal art refined over centuries. Empires rose and fell not just due to internal strife or environmental collapse, but often at the hands of a more technologically advanced or strategically astute rival. The constant arms race ensured that military innovation was a relentless driver of societal change, always reinforcing the need for centralized authority, organized labor, and a dedicated military class. The quote 22 of living in the gilded cage now included protection. Protection from other gilded cages, protection from the very system that created the conflict in the first place. For the vast majority of people, the human cost of this grand imperial project remained immense. Life in the shadow of these monumental achievements was often a grueling existence. Debt became a pervasive and often inescapable trap, leading to debt slavery, a common feature of early legal codes. Conscription for military service or forced labor on state projects was a constant threat. The diet, though stable for many, was often monotonous and deficient compared to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Disease, fostered by dense urban living and poor sanitation, remained a constant companion. Freedom, in any meaningful sense, was a luxury reserved for the very few. The paradox here is stark, isn't it? These civilizations, these quote 23, enabled incredible collective marvels: writing, complex mathematics, astronomy, breathtaking art and architecture, sophisticated legal systems, and vast trade networks. These were undeniable achievements of the human spirit and intellect. But who truly benefited? For the average person, the price was often a life of toil, subjugation, and diminished autonomy. The benefits of civilization were largely asymmetrical, accruing disproportionately to the elites who designed, managed, and controlled the system. And the most insidious aspect of this continued evolution of the quote 24 was perhaps the psychological one. Over generations, the hierarchy, the inequality, the constant labor, and the state's pervasive control became normalized. It was simply, quote 25, quote, the divine king, the powerful priest, the stern tax collector, the ever-present soldier. These figures became immutable parts of the landscape. The very idea of individual freedom, of a life lived outside the state's purview, began to fade from collective memory, replaced by the ingrained ideology of duty, obedience, and one's ordained place within the grand, eternal order of the empire. empires, as we know, are not eternal. They rise, they expand, they reach their zenith, and then they inevitably decline and fall. The names changed. Akkad gave way to Babylon, Babylon to Assyria, Assyria to the Neo-Babylonians, and then the Persians. In Egypt, dynasties followed dynasties. In China, one ruling house was replaced by another in a cyclical pattern of rise and collapse. But here's the crucial point. When one empire fell, it wasn't a return to the hunter-gatherer freedom of old. It was almost always replaced by another, built upon the same fundamental blueprint. The names on the monuments might change, the specific gods might shift, the language of the laws might evolve, but the underlying structure of the gilded cage, intensive agriculture, centralized power, social stratification, and organized warfare persisted. It was a resilient system, a template that humanity seemed incapable of escaping. The path was set, and we were locked in, forever refining the very cage we had, in our collective audacity and desperation built for ourselves. The trap once sprung was unbreakable. That's the chilling reality we face when looking at the grand sweep of human history. Once the plough had broken the soil, once the granary stood full, once the walls went up around the accumulated wealth, there was no going back. The demographic momentum alone was too great. Populations had swelled to numbers that the old ways of foraging simply couldn't sustain. We had, quite literally, burned our bridges back to the wild, free life. What began in the Fertile Crescent, that crescent-shaped band of land where our agricultural journey first took root, wasn't an isolated experiment. It was a blueprint, a remarkably robust and adaptable template for human social organization that would, independently, arise again and again across the globe. Think of it as a set of instructions. Step 1, intensify food production. Step 2, accumulate surplus. Step 3, build walls, create hierarchy, manage resources. Step 4, watch your population explode and your individual freedom evaporate. Let's cast our gaze beyond Mesopotamia, that initial crucible of civilization, and see how this pattern, this gilded cage, manifested in other corners of the ancient world. Because here's the thing that truly blows my mind. The sheer audacity of human innovation, yet the uncanny similarity in the ultimate outcomes. Consider ancient Egypt, for instance. You might think of pharaohs, pyramids, and the life-giving Nile. And you'd be right. But look closer. What was Egypt at its core? A civilization built entirely on the predictable annual flooding of a single river. The Nile provided an unparalleled agricultural bounty, a food surplus so vast it could support a population far denser than almost anywhere else. But managing that bounty, ensuring its equitable distribution, and organizing the labor for irrigation canals and flood control, that required a centralized authority, a bureaucracy, and a powerful ideology to bind it all together. Enter the pharaoh. Not just a king, but a living god, the embodiment of cosmic order, whose divine presence ensured the Nile's fertility. This wasn't merely a figurehead, it was the ultimate justification for a rigid social hierarchy, for demanding monumental labor, and for the vast state apparatus that managed everything from grain stores to foreign policy. The pyramids, those enduring symbols of ancient Egypt, weren't just tombs. They were colossal statements of power, faith, and the state's ability to command unimaginable resources and human effort. They were, in essence, the ultimate advertisement for the gilded cage. promising eternal order and divine favor in exchange for a lifetime of service. For the average Egyptian peasant, life was still backbreaking labor in the fields, punctuated by forced conscription for state projects, a life of duty, not freedom. The progress was for the collective, for the pharaoh, for the gods, but rarely for the individual. Then there's the enigmatic Indus Valley civilization, flourishing almost simultaneously with Mesopotamia and Egypt around 2500 BCE. Here, along the Indus River in present-day Pakistan and India, arose cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. What's striking about these cities is their meticulously planned layouts, their advanced urban sanitation systems, complete with indoor plumbing and sophisticated drainage, and a sense of order that suggests a powerful, albeit mysterious, central authority. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, we don't find massive palaces or obvious temples dominating the urban landscape. There's no clear evidence of individual pharaoh-like rulers or grand royal tombs. Their writing system, the Indus script, remains undeciphered, shrouding their political and religious structures in mystery. But don't let the lack of overt monumental displays fool you. These were still complex, stratified societies built on agricultural surplus, wheat, barley, cotton. The sheer scale of urban planning, the standardization of weights and measures, the extensive trade networks, all point to a highly organized, administered society. Even if the power structure wasn't embodied in a single divine king, it was clearly present, coordinating vast resources and labor. And like their counterparts, the average inhabitant of Mohenjo-daro was likely a farmer or artisan, contributing their labor to the collective good, bound by the demands of the urban system. The gilded cage here might have had a different aesthetic, perhaps more communal, less overtly militaristic, but it was a cage nonetheless, built on the same fundamental principles of intensive agriculture, surplus, and social organization. Its eventual decline, around 1900 BCE, remains a puzzle. Perhaps due to environmental changes or shifting river courses, a stark reminder of the inherent fragility of even the most sophisticated civilizations when faced with external pressures. Move further east to ancient China, along the Yellow River. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the first dynasties, like the Shang, were emerging. Here we see another independent instantiation of the gilded cage blueprint. Agricultural surplus, primarily millet and later rice, fueled population growth. Centralized power coalesced around kings who claimed a mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule that legitimized their authority and demanded obedience. Ancestor worship became a powerful tool for social cohesion and legitimization, linking the living to the dead and reinforcing hierarchical structures. The Shang kings, like their Mesopotamian and Egyptian counterparts, commanded vast resources, constructing elaborate bronze ritual vessels, weapons, and chariots, symbols of elite power and technological prowess. They built walled cities, organized armies, and developed a complex writing system, the Oracle Bone script, used for divination, record-keeping, and solidifying royal authority. The collective achievements, the sophisticated bronze metallurgy, the complex calendrical systems, the early philosophical traditions were undeniable. But these achievements were built on the backs of a vast peasantry, whose lives were dictated by the cycle of planting and harvest, by the demands of tribute and labor for the state. The gilded cage in China was reinforced by a powerful philosophical and religious framework that emphasized order, duty, and hierarchy, subtly but firmly locking individuals into their predetermined roles. And what about the Americas? Far removed from the old world, entirely independent, yet the pattern repeated. In Mesoamerica, the domestication of maize led to the rise of complex societies like the Olmec circa 1200 BCE, often called the mother culture of later Mesoamerican civilizations. They built monumental earthworks, carved colossal stone heads, and developed early writing and calendrical systems. In the Andean region of South America, the domestication of potatoes and other crops fueled the development of sophisticated societies like the Chavin circa 900 BCE. These civilizations too were characterized by agricultural surplus, social stratification, monumental architecture, and powerful religious or political elites who commanded labor and resources. The particular flavor might have been different crops, different gods, different artistic styles, but the underlying structure of the gilded cage was unmistakably there. This global, independent replication of the same fundamental societal structure is frankly astounding. It suggests that once humanity crossed the threshold into intensive agriculture, the pressures and opportunities it created led almost inexorably to the same outcomes: hierarchy, bureaucracy, monumental construction, and the concentration of power. The Faustian bargain was universal, not just a local anomaly. So how did these systems, despite the immense cost to individual well-being and freedom, manage to perpetuate themselves for millennia? It wasn't just brute force, although coercion and warfare were certainly part of the equation. It was a multi-layered system of control and legitimation, ideology and religion. As we've seen, divine kingship, the mandate of heaven, the pharaoh as god, the role of priests in interpreting the will of the cosmos. These weren't just quaint beliefs. They were incredibly powerful tools for legitimizing the social order. They convinced people that their place in the hierarchy was divinely ordained, that their suffering was part of a cosmic plan, or that their labor was a sacred duty. This ideological glue bound societies together, making rebellion against the established order not just a political act, but a sacrilege. Bureaucracy and record-keeping. The invention of writing, initially for accounting, evolved into a tool for statecraft. Bureaucrats, scribes, and administrators became the nervous system of the, quote, 36, quote. They managed tax collection, organized labor, drafted laws, and kept track of everything and everyone. This administrative capacity allowed states to grow larger, control more territory, and extract resources more efficiently. It transformed individuals into data points, manageable units within a vast system. Technological. Quote 37. As tools of control. The development of metallurgy, particularly bronze, was a game changer. Bronze weapons gave rulers and their armies a decisive advantage, allowing them to enforce their will both internally and externally. Irrigation systems, while increasing food production, also created dependencies and required central coordination, further consolidating power. Roads, initially for trade and communication, also served as arteries for military movement and administrative control. The threat of warfare. The quote 38 wasn't just an internal construct. It operated in a world of competing cages. The need to defend accumulated wealth, to secure resources, and to expand territory led to constant interstate warfare. This perpetual state of conflict provided another justification for strong central authority, for standing armies, and for demanding sacrifices from the populace. It fostered a sense of collective identity against an other, further solidifying the internal power structures. The choice was often framed as endure the demands of our state, or suffer conquest and enslavement by another. The cycle was relentless. Empires rose and fell, but each collapse was not a return to the hunter-gatherer ideal. It was usually a period of chaos followed by another power rebuilding on the same fundamental blueprint. The gilded cage was refined, its bars made stronger, its gilded elements more elaborate, but it remained a cage. What we witness across these early civilizations is a testament to humanity's incredible capacity for organization and collective achievement. We built cities, invented writing, developed mathematics, created breathtaking art, and formulated complex legal systems. But these monumental achievements came at a profound and often tragic cost. The erosion of individual freedom, the entrenchment of inequality, the burden of ceaseless labour, and the constant threat of violence. We had, it seems, traded the wild, untamed beauty of the open plain for the structured, fertile, but ultimately confining walls of civilization. And from this path, once taken, there was no turning back. The stage was set for ever larger, ever more complex empires, each one a new iteration of the same enduring paradox. We left off with a profound question, didn't we? Why? Why did we, as a species, willingly step into this gilded cage of civilization, trading the robust health and relative leisure of our hunter-gatherer ancestors for back-breaking labour, disease, hierarchy, and war? It's a paradox that haunts the birth of every major civilization, a question that nags at the very idea of linear progress. But here's the thing. Once we stepped in, it became incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to step back out. The chains, initially forged of necessity, became unbreakable. Think about it for a second. The agricultural revolution, for all its individual downsides, delivered one undeniable, colossal benefit. More people. A lot more people. When you shift from hunting and gathering, which requires vast tracts of land to support a small population, to intensive farming, which can feed exponential numbers from the same acreage, your population explodes. We're talking about a demographic boom that makes the modern era look quaint. Suddenly, there were simply too many mouths to feed to ever go back to the old ways. The land, once teeming with wild game and forage for small mobile bands, was now crisscrossed with irrigation ditches and covered in monoculture fields. The very landscape of our existence had been irrevocably altered. This, my friends, is the first and most critical chain, the population trap. Imagine a society that has grown from a few hundred souls to tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands. How do you suddenly revert to a nomadic lifestyle? Where would you go? What would you eat? The knowledge of the wild, once passed down through generations, had atrophied. The skills of the hunt, while not entirely lost, were no longer sufficient for the sheer scale of humanity. We had multiplied ourselves into a corner, sealing our fate with every new birth. And with that burgeoning population came an intensification of all the forces we've discussed. More people meant more food was needed, which meant more sophisticated and labour-intensive agriculture. More agriculture meant more surplus, which meant more wealth to protect. More wealth meant more conflict, both internally over resources and externally against those who coveted what you had. This wasn't just a choice anymore, it was a cascading series of necessities. Here's where the state in its nascent form truly solidified its grip. Remember, the early state wasn't just an instrument of oppression, though it certainly became one. It was also in many ways a solution. When you have tens of thousands of people living in close proximity, dependent on complex irrigation systems and massive harvests, who manages all that? Who organises the labour for the canals? Who ensures fair distribution when harvests are lean? Who defends the granaries from raiders? The answer, time and again, was a centralised authority. The chiefs, the priests, the kings, they weren't just taking power, they were often given power, or at least allowed to consolidate it, because someone had to steer the ship. This is where the gilded cage truly began to feel less like a choice, and more like a collective organism, with us as its cells. The state became the indispensable manager of complexity. It built the roads that allowed armies and goods to move. It dug the canals that watered the fields. It erected the temples that gave meaning and order to a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. And in exchange for this perceived stability and organization, we, the common people, offered our labor, our loyalty, and our freedom. Let's talk about the tools that cemented this new reality, the invisible and visible structures that made the cage so robust. First, there was law. Before civilization, social norms were largely unwritten, enforced by custom, community pressure, and perhaps the occasional spear. But in a complex society, with strangers living side by side and property accumulating, you needed rules. You needed a system to arbitrate disputes, to define ownership, to punish transgressions. Enter Hammurabi's Code, one of the earliest and most famous examples, etched in stone for all to see, or at least for those who could read, or had it read to them. These laws weren't just about justice, they were about order. They defined the social hierarchy, often protecting the property and status of the elite far more rigorously than the rights of the commoner. They transformed individual grievances into state matters, further centralizing authority. Then came ideology and religion. We've touched on divine kingship, but let's dig a little deeper. In a world where life was hard, unpredictable, and often brutal, religion offered solace, explanation, and a powerful justification for the existing order. The pharaoh wasn't just a man, he was a god, or at least a divine intermediary. The Mesopotamian kings ruled by the will of the gods. This wasn't just clever propaganda, it was a deeply held belief system that permeated every aspect of life. It made obedience not just a civic duty, but a sacred one. To defy the king was to defy the gods, a terrifying prospect that kept the masses in line more effectively than any army. Religion also provided a shared narrative, a collective identity that bound disparate groups together, giving them a sense of belonging to something larger and more enduring than themselves. It explained suffering, promised an afterlife, and provided rituals that marked the rhythm of life and reinforced community bonds. It was, in short, the glue that held the expanding social fabric together. And let's not forget infrastructure. Those monumental ziggurats and pyramids weren't just impressive displays of power. They were massive public works that employed thousands, demonstrating the king's ability to mobilize vast resources and labor. The irrigation canals, the roads, the city walls, these were tangible benefits, often built through forced labour, but benefits nonetheless. They facilitated trade, allowed for rapid deployment of troops, and protected the populace. They physically connected the various parts of the state, literally paving the way for centralized control and economic integration. These were the sinews and bones of the early state, binding it together. This sophisticated apparatus, law, religion, bureaucracy, infrastructure, and a standing military, created a self-perpetuating system. The problems created by dense populations and intensive agriculture, disease, famine, conflict, were, quote, 43 by stronger states, which in turn demanded more resources, more control, and more conformity from their subjects. It was a vicious cycle, but one that paradoxically led to unprecedented collective achievements: writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex metallurgy, monumental art. These were the glittering ornaments of the gilded cage, reminding us of the human ingenuity that thrived even within its confines. But what about the cost? For the average person, life within this system was a constant negotiation with hardship. Debt slavery was rampant. Famine was a recurring threat, exacerbated by reliance on a few staple crops. Diseases, previously unknown or rare, swept through dense urban centres, and warfare, once perhaps a localised skirmish between bands, became a massive organised enterprise, with professional armies clashing for territory, resources and tribute. The Arcistes quote for was often less gilded and more a brutal, unyielding reality. This blueprint, this quote 45s of history, wasn't confined to Mesopotamia. We saw it replicated with stunning regularity across the globe. The pharaonic dynasties of Egypt, rising along the Nile, the mysterious cities of the Indus Valley, the early kingdoms of China along the Yellow River, and later the Olmec and Chavin cultures in the Americas. Each developed its own unique cultural flavour, its own pantheon of gods, its own artistic expressions, but the underlying structure remained eerily similar: intensive agriculture, population density, social stratification, centralized power, monumental architecture, and the tools of control. It's almost as if once the first domino fell, the commitment to agriculture, the rest were destined to follow, each civilization independently arriving at the same fundamental solutions to the problems it had inadvertently created for itself. The paradox of civilization, then, is that its very success in supporting larger populations and creating complex societies also trapped us. We built systems that were too big to fail, too complex to dismantle, and too necessary for the survival of the millions who now depended on them. The freedom of the open plain was replaced by the security and oppression of the city wall. The varied diet of the hunter-gatherer gave way to the monotonous gruel of the farmer. The egalitarian band was subsumed by the hierarchical empire. There was no going back. The river of history had flowed irrevocably into new channels. We were no longer small bands of mobile, adaptable foragers. We were the builders of empires, the cultivators of vast fields, the subjects of kings and priests. We had traded immediate individual well-being for collective survival, and in doing so we had set ourselves on a trajectory from which there was no return. The gilded cage was complete, its bars strong, its architecture intricate, and within it humanity would continue to evolve, to struggle, to innovate, and to define what it meant to be human in this new, complex, and often cruel world. The stage was set for the grand drama of ancient empires, their rise, their conflicts, and their inevitable falls, shaping the very foundations of the world we inhabit today. The blueprint was drawn, etched in mud brick and cuneiform, codified in law and ritual sacrifice. We had built the gilded cage, and now it was time to expand it. The path from the overgrown village to the sprawling city-state was clear, a well-trodden route paved with communal effort and the slow, grinding work of generations. But what came next was the logical, if terrifying, extension of that same logic. The empire. It was an inevitability whispered in the rustle of papyrus and the clinking of bronze armour, a destiny forged in the very act of successful organisation. The cage, once a protective shell, was destined to become a sprawling dominion. Think about this for a second. You've got a successful city-state, like Uruk, with its massive population, its specialised artisans, its granaries overflowing, most years, and its ziggurat temples reaching for the sky, a beacon of human ambition. You've got a king, a priesthood, a bureaucracy, and an army. The city hums with life, a complex organism thriving within its walls. But the king, perhaps a figure like the legendary Gilgamesh, stands atop his ramparts, gazing out at the fertile plains. His mind, honed by years of governance and warfare, doesn't see mere fields or distant hills. He sees resources untapped, labour unharnessed, and most pressingly, rivals whose own burgeoning power threatens his prosperity. He feels the pressure of his own success, the sheer momentum of his people demanding more. What do you do with all that concentrated power, all that surplus energy and human potential? You project it. You look beyond your walls, beyond your fields, and you see not just neighbours, but potential subjects, strategic choke points, and valuable minerals. You recognise the opportunity to consolidate, to control, to command. And that, my friends, is how empires are born. It's less a choice, more a consequence of accumulated power, a system reaching its natural, terrifying conclusion. It wasn't a sudden invention, a flash of genius in a lone ruler's mind, but rather an organic, almost inevitable escalation of the state-building process we've been tracing. Sargon of Akkad, whom we briefly touched on, wasn't just a king. He was an emperor, forging a vast dominion from disparate Sumerian city-states around 2334 BCE. Imagine the sheer audacity, the strategic brilliance, the ruthless will required to accomplish such a feat for the first time. He didn't just conquer, he absorbed, he integrated, he commanded a scale of human organization previously unimaginable. He was a pioneer in this new, grander game, setting a precedent that would echo through history. His methods, and those of the empires that followed, set a pattern that would reverberate through millennia. Conquest, administration, and the relentless extraction of resources. It was a new paradigm, a fundamental shift in how human societies interacted and expanded. Here's the thing that often gets lost in the romanticized tales of ancient glory, in the epic poems and some monumental inscriptions. Empires are fundamentally about power and control, often achieved through violence and maintained through coercion. The, quote 46, didn't just get bigger. Its bars became thicker, its locks more intricate, its reach more encompassing. The individual, already subsumed by the city-state, now became a mere cog in an even vaster, more impersonal machine. Their identity, their very sense of self began to blur. No longer were they simply a farmer from the banks of the Euphrates, or a weaver from Lagash. They were a subject of the great king, an indistinguishable part of a colossal entity whose demands superseded all local loyalties. This wasn't freedom. It was a new, more profound form of subjugation, camouflaged by the promise of order and protection, yet enforced by an iron fist. How did these colossal entities function, maintaining cohesion across such vast and diverse territories? First, warfare shifted dramatically. No longer were we talking about tribal skirmishes or city-state squabbles over a patch of fertile land or a disputed canal. Empires required professional standing armies, highly organized, well-equipped, and loyal to the central authority, not just their local lord. These weren't just seasonal warriors, they were instruments of state policy, trained for sustained campaigns, capable of siege warfare, large-scale logistics, and coordinated movements across vast distances. Imagine the thunder of 1,000 marching feet, the glint of bronze spears stretching to the horizon, the disciplined shouts of commanders, the plough over the spear. Yes, but now the state wielded the spear with unprecedented might, often forcing the ploughman to drop his tools and pick up a shield, his life now dictated by distant imperial ambitions. The constant need for military might further entrenched the state's power, demanding more taxes, more conscripts, and more centralized decision-making. Every victory solidified the emperor's rule. Every defeat threatened the very fabric of existence, demanding even greater sacrifices from the populace. Second, administration became an art form, a science even. How do you govern dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of miles away from your capital, ensuring tribute flows and laws are upheld? You build bureaucracies, intricate webs of officials and scribes. Scribe KL, hunched over his clay tablet in a provincial outpost, meticulously records every bushel of grain, every head of cattle, every conscripted youth. He works by lamplight, his fingers aching, knowing that a single error could mean punishment, or worse, a disruption to the imperial machine. They standardize weights and measures, introduce common currencies, and crucially, they build infrastructure on a scale never before seen. Roads weren't just for trade. They were for armies, for messengers, for the swift transmission of imperial decrees, binding the empire with ribbons of packed earth and stone. Canals weren't just for irrigation. They were for moving goods, connecting distant provinces, and demonstrating the sheer power of the central authority to reshape the very landscape. Think of the monumental scale of this project. The scorching sun beating down on thousands of labourers, the rhythmic chant of overseers, the constant dust, all requiring vast amounts of coordinated labour, often coerced, all to bind the disparate parts of an empire together, to make the distant feel close and the foreign feel familiar. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, was the development of imperial ideology. How do you convince diverse peoples, often conquered and resentful, to accept your rule? You claim divine sanction. Your emperor isn't just a man, he's a god, or chosen by the gods, or at least a divine representative whose will is sacred. This legitimizes his power, making resistance not just treason, but blasphemy against the cosmic order. The great king's authority flows from the heavens, an imperial priest might declare, his voice echoing through a newly built temple. To defy him is to defy the very gods who ordained this empire. You erect monumental architecture, colossal temples, sprawling palaces, towering victory steely carved with scenes of imperial triumph that scream the emperor's power and the empire's eternal glory. These weren't just buildings. They were physical manifestations of absolute power, designed to make any individual feel utterly insignificant. You cultivate a sense of shared identity, often through force, celebrating the imperial culture as superior, civilizing, and inevitable. This wasn't just about physical control, it was about controlling the very minds and beliefs of the populace, rewriting their history and their future. The impact on the average individual was profound. Your identity, once rooted in your family, your village, or your city-state, now became subsumed under the vast, often suffocating umbrella of the empire. You were no longer just a farmer from Sumer, proud of your local deity and your ancestral lands. You were a subject of a card expected to contribute to a distant, abstract entity. Your local gods might persist, worshipped in hushed tones in private homes, but the imperial cult demanded your public fealty, a constant reminder of who held ultimate power. Your labour, your crops, your very sons could be conscripted for the greater imperial good, whether it was building a new palace, digging a canal, or fighting in a distant war. A mother, watching her youngest son march off with the imperial levy, might whisper a prayer to her old gods, knowing their power felt diminished against the might of the emperor's legions. The demands were relentless, the personal cost immense, a constant pressure that shaped every aspect of daily life. Yet, here's the paradox that makes this period so fascinating and, frankly, a bit tragic. These early empires, despite their brutality and their crushing demands on the individual, also facilitated an unprecedented scale of cultural exchange and innovation. When empires conquer, they don't just destroy, they absorb, they mingle, they cross-pollinate. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, religious concepts, they all travelled along those imperial roads, often against the will of the people, but travel they did, carried by merchants, soldiers, and administrators. A skilled metallurgist from Elam might find himself working alongside a craftsman from Mesopotamia, sharing techniques that led to improved tools and weapons. Astronomical observations became more sophisticated as knowledge from different regions coalesced. Mathematical systems advanced with new practical applications for administration, and writing became even more widespread and versatile, evolving to manage the empire's vast records. These collective achievements, born from the crucible of centralized power and forced labor, laid the groundwork for future civilizations, a testament to humanity's enduring capacity for creation, even amidst destruction. It's almost as if the very pressures that made individual life harder, that stripped away personal agency and local autonomy, also created the conditions for humanity's collective brain to achieve wonders. We were building grander things, writing more complex stories, understanding the cosmos in new ways, all while the average person toiled under a heavier yoke than ever before. It's a trade-off that, from our modern perspective, seems almost unthinkable. Individual suffering for collective glory, for the advancement of a civilization that might not even remember their name. But within the logic of the, quote, 49 within the stark realities of survival and power in the ancient world, it was simply the way things were, accepted as the natural order. The cycle was now set. States would rise, expand into empires, and eventually, due to overextension, internal strife, or external threats, they would fall. But the underlying system of civilization, the core blueprint of intensive agriculture, centralized power, social stratification, and monumental organization, would not disappear. Instead, it would be picked up by the next aspiring power, refined, adapted, and re-implemented. The pieces on the board might change, a new dynasty, a different conqueror, a fresh set of gods, but the game itself, the game of civilization, was now the default mode of human existence. There was no going back to the open plain, no return to the simpler tribal life, not with millions now dependent on the very structures that constrained them. We had committed. We were in too deep. The stakes were higher, the scale grander, and the individual further subsumed into the colossal machinery we had built. The quote 50, then, was not merely a static structure. It was a living, breathing, ravenously hungry entity. Once established, once the blueprint for centralized power, professional armies, and systematic resource extraction had been etched into the very fabric of human existence, there was no going back. The sheer weight of population, the intricate webs of bureaucracy, the monumental investments in infrastructure, all conspired to make any reversion to a simpler, more egalitarian past utterly unthinkable. We had multiplied, and in doing so, we had trapped ourselves. But this was just the beginning. The foundational empires, Sargon's Akkad, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the enigmatic cities of the Indus, the nascent dynasties of China, the Olmec chiefdoms, were like the first powerful tremors of a geological shift. What followed was a period of intense interaction, competition, and an accelerating arms race, both literal and metaphorical. Humanity, now organized into these vast competing superorganisms, began to truly flex its collective muscle, often with devastating consequences for the individuals caught in the sears. Think about it. You have these distinct centers of power, each with its own god-kings, scribes, soldiers, and farmers, each convinced of its own divine right and superior culture. What happens when they bump up against each other? The answer, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is rarely a friendly exchange of recipes. Instead, it's a clash of ideologies, a struggle for resources, and an endless, escalating cycle of innovation driven by the imperative to dominate or survive. This was the dawn of what we often call the Bronze Age, an era defined by a new mastery over metal. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder, sharper, and more durable than pure copper. It transformed warfare. Suddenly the simple stone axe and copper dagger were outmatched by bronze swords, spears and shields. Armies became more formidable, battles more lethal. The acquisition of tin, often found far from copper deposits, spurred the development of vast interconnected trade networks, stretching across continents. Mesopotamian merchants traded with the Indus Valley. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged elaborate gift with Hittite kings, and Mycenaean Greeks sailed the Aegean, linking disparate civilizations in a complex web of commerce and diplomacy. This wasn't just about pretty trinkets. It was about strategic resources, control over trade routes, access to rare metals, and the ability to project power became paramount. Empires expanded, not just by conquering their immediate neighbours, but by establishing spheres of influence that ensured a steady supply of what they needed. This expansion, however, created larger, more unwieldy entities, stretching administrative capacities to their limits and inviting internal dissent and external attack. Consider the Fertile Crescent, that cradle of so much human ingenuity and suffering. It became a geopolitical chessboard where empires rose and fell with dizzying frequency. After Akkad, we saw the rise of the Neo-Sumerian Ur III dynasty, followed by the Amorite kingdom of Babylon, whose most famous ruler, Hammurabi, codified a legal system that starkly delineated social classes and their unequal rights. Quote, 51. Yes, but only if both eyes belonged to men of the same social standing. If a commoner struck a nobleman, the punishment was far harsher. The law itself was a tool of the gilded cage, reinforcing hierarchy and control. Further north, the Hittites emerged as a formidable power, mastering iron working earlier than many of their contemporaries. Iron, more abundant than tin and copper, promised to democratize metallurgy, but initially it was a closely guarded state secret. The Hittite Empire clashed repeatedly with the New Kingdom of Egypt, culminating in the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in history, a testament to the escalating scale of organized warfare. Chariots, those terrifying, fast-moving platforms of death, represented a new level of military technology, requiring specialized training, advanced craftsmanship, and significant state investment. These interactions weren't always hostile. They also fostered an incredible exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Writing systems evolved and spread, mathematical concepts travelled with traders, and astronomical observations were shared and refined. This intermingling of cultures, however, also meant that the weaknesses of one civilization could quickly become the vulnerability of another. Diseases once localized now had vast networks to travel along, periodically devastating populations. The very connections that brought wealth and knowledge also brought plague and destruction. And then, around 1200 BCE, something truly cataclysmic happened. Across the entire Near East, the Bronze Age system, so seemingly robust, collapsed. Major cities were destroyed, trade routes severed, writing systems forgotten, and powerful empires like the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and even parts of the New Kingdom of Egypt simply vanished or were severely curtailed. This period, often called the Bronze Age collapse, remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it climate change causing widespread famine, internal rebellions, the enigmatic sea peoples who swept across the Mediterranean, or a combination of all these factors, an overstretched, interconnected system simply reaching its breaking point? Regardless of the precise cause, the collapse was a brutal reset. It stripped away much of the accumulated complexity, but it did not, crucially, dismantle the fundamental blueprint of civilization. Instead, it paved the way for a new, even more aggressive phase, the Iron Age. Iron, once a rare and difficult metal to work, now became the dominant material. Its widespread availability meant that larger armies could be equipped more cheaply. This was a game changer. It democratized military power to a degree, allowing new, often more ruthless empires to rise. Think of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a truly terrifying force that emerged from Mesopotamia. The Assyrians perfected the art of total warfare, employing siege engines, mass deportations, and calculated terror to subjugate vast territories. Their empire was a meticulously organized machine of conquest and exploitation, a chillingly efficient version of the gilded cage, where the cages were built with iron and the gilding was the blood of conquered peoples. The Assyrians, and later the Persians under Cyrus the Great, established empires on a scale previously unimaginable. The Persian Achaemenid Empire, stretching from Greece to India, was the largest the world had yet seen. How did they manage such vastness? Through sophisticated administration, a network of royal roads, a standardized currency, and a remarkable degree of tolerance for local customs, as long as taxes were paid and loyalty maintained. It was a more refined, perhaps less overtly brutal, gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. The individual farmer in Egypt or the artisan in Lydia was still a cog in a massive imperial machine, his labour and loyalty extracted to support a distant king and an elite class. This trajectory, from localised city-states to competing regional empires, and then to vast interconnected super-empires, was not unique to the Near East. In China, the Zhou dynasty, having overthrown the Shang, established a complex feudal system that eventually fractured into warring states, a period of intense intellectual ferment and brutal conflict that ultimately culminated in the unification under the Qin dynasty and the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. His ruthless centralization, standardization, and monumental projects like the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, represented the Chinese version of the ultimate gilded cage, built with immense human cost. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec gave way to the Zapotec, Maya, and Teotihuacan, each developing complex urban centers, sophisticated writing systems, and elaborate religious hierarchies that legitimized their ruling elites. In the Andes, the Chavin culture influenced later civilizations like the Moche and Nazca, who also built large-scale irrigation systems, monumental temples, and stratified societies. The patterns were strikingly similar: agricultural surplus leading to population growth, leading to social stratification, leading to centralized power, leading to warfare and empire, leading to the continued subjugation of the individual for the perceived collective good. The paradox deepened with every passing century. We built grander cities, developed more complex philosophies, charted the stars with greater precision, and created breathtaking works of art. We engineered vast aqueducts, compiled encyclopedic libraries, and forged legal codes that, while often cruel, sought to bring order to ever larger populations. Yet, for the vast majority of humanity, life remained a relentless cycle of hard labour, vulnerability to famine and disease, and the ever-present threat of war or enslavement. The progress was real, but its benefits remained profoundly asymmetrical, accruing to the few at the expense of the many. We had created systems so complex, so interconnected, and so demographically entrenched that escaping them became impossible. The very act of living now required the existence of the state, the empire, the gilded cage. It provided protection, organized large-scale projects, and maintained a semblance of order in a world now teeming with human life. But it also demanded absolute obedience, extracted immense resources, and normalized inequality and suffering as an immutable part of the human condition. We had traded the vast open plains of our hunter-gatherer ancestors for the gilded yet confining walls of empire, and in doing so we had locked ourselves into a path from which there was truly no return. The question was no longer if we would live in these cages, but how we would manage to survive within them, and what new, unforeseen consequences our choices would unleash upon ourselves and the planet.